continues.
All right, folks, we know it is early on a Saturday morning, but it is never too early to start cramming for the exam. And the exam we're talking about today is the U.S. Government Advanced Placement Test. High school students across the country will be taking this exam on Tuesday. And here to provide a study guide for us are two teachers from Adelaide Stevenson High School in Lincolnshire, Illinois. We're joined by Andrew Caneen and Daniel Larson. Thank you guys so much for being here this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
So it's been a long time since I was in high school. Tell us a little bit about this test and why it's so important. Andrew?
Well, this test is on Tuesday. And this is a test. Some students take it for one semester. Some students take it for a full year. But it's prepping them for the basics of political science 101. So if they do well enough in the exam, they can earn college credit.
And this has been called the Kentucky Derby of exams. Why has it earned that name?
Well, this is the big derby, of course, for students. We also call it our Super Tuesday. We're not choosing candidates on Tuesday. Students across America will be choosing the right answer. And Yolanda, the questions are 60 multiple choice questions in a 45-minute time span. And then they'll have 4 free response questions where students will be asked difficult concepts to explain, discuss, and identify. We're here to make the complex simple and the confusing clear, and hopefully our deliberate practice today will help every student out there do their best and hit their peak performance.
Now, there's just a few days left before the exam. How should students be using their time to study?
I think Mr. Larson hit it. Look at the concepts of government. Look at the key definitions. Think of synonyms for those words, and especially think of how those concepts mix. We always tell our students right before you're going into the exam, think of those examples of checks and balances.
Well, Yolanda, this is where it becomes the derby because I'm betting on workout today. And if you work hard, you can do well in this test.
All right. Well, so we're opening up the phone lines to high school students only for this segment. Here is how we are breaking them down. If you live in the Eastern and Central time zones, your number is 202-748-8000. If you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, your number is 202-748-8001. You can also send us your thoughts on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is at CSpanWJ. You can also use the hashtag because that's what high school kids do, right? The hashtag is APCram4EX, APCram4exam. All right, we'll go straight to the callers now. And Tara from Mason, Ohio will be the first one. Tara, go ahead.
I'd just like to give a shout out to my APGOV teacher first, Miss Miller. She's a great teacher. And my question is, what are typical questions that you see on the exam?
Well, typical questions. One, we want to thank all the teachers out there. Because of you, your students are going to be well prepared on Tuesday. Boy, what types of questions? I think you'll see questions on the big topics. And the big topics for us are foundations, federalism, public opinion, participation, political parties, campaigns and elections, interest groups, Congress, courts, and don't forget about the president.
Well, absolutely. And then learn how to mix those concepts. Political parties is a great example. This is not a current events test, but the more you know about political parties, the nomination process, you can use that information to help you on the test.
And what do you expect to see for the free response questions that you mentioned? What types of questions are usually asked for that?
Well, usually they're higher level thinking. Usually a free response question is worth between 6 and 7 points on a rubric. So fight for those points. Even if it looks like you might not understand some of the concepts, try to get some of the easier points in the free response, and then write. Keep on writing. Think about how those concepts connect.
We tell our students on the FRQs to think less, ink more. So think about it, but then ink a lot about it.
And you have a limited amount of time to answer those questions.
100 minutes, 4 questions, and there'll be multi-part questions with an A and a B and a C and a D. Read each carefully, restate the exact vocabulary in each section repeatedly, and use examples. If it says explain, more than 1 or 2 sentences.
All right, Lauren from Elkhart, Indiana is up next. Lauren, what's your question?
Hi.
Good morning. Turn down your TV. Yeah. Turn down your TV, Lauren. You're on the air.
Hi. I'd like to give a shout out to Mr. Fafaro from Concord High School. And my question is regarding the amendments, and I was wondering which amendments we should know and if we need to know all of them.
Oh, the amendments, of course. But I would start with your Bill of Rights for sure. Amendments 1 through 10. know the purpose of the Bill of Rights. The purpose of the Bill of Rights originally was intended to constrain the powers of the national government. So even if they don't ask a specific question about a specific amendment, we know that you should know that the Bill of Rights originally were intended to restrain government. With the 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause, you should know that the Due Process Clause was used to incorporate parts of the Bill of Rights to apply to state governments.
I would know those suffrage amendments too, 15, 19, and 26.
And I want to mention, speaking of the Constitution, that we have a pocket Constitution here to give away to a caller. Why don't you guys tell us how you plan to decide who the winner will be?
Well, every year we get a signed pocket Constitution. Sometimes it's a Supreme Court justice. Sometimes it's Hulk Hogan. This year it's the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, who signed this pocket Constitution. And we're going to award that to a student who calls in with a question about Congress.
All right. Grant from Dubuque, Iowa is up next. Grant, go ahead.
Hi, I'd like to give a shout out to Mr. Miller's 5th period APGOV class. You guys talk a lot about synonyms on the AP test. So what synonyms do you think will be covered on the test next week?
My favorite synonym is suffrage. And that students should know that suffrage is voting rights. We could also go pork projects. And maybe you see the word pork projects on the test, or maybe you see the word federal earmarks.
I say the toughest synonym we've seen in recent years is constituent service, but now casework. Most textbooks, and a lot of us have been teaching and talking about constituent service for a long time, but don't freak out if you see a little casework on Tuesday's test.
Now, we do have a few sample questions from the test here that we can sort of quiz our viewers on here. Here is one of them. This is from the AP U.S. government exam. The question is, the original Constitution was ratified in 1789. Which political offices were directly elected? You can see that the choices here are House of Representatives, U.S. Senate President, federal judges, or executive department heads. Which one is it?
Oh, let the students decide.
All right, Alexis.
We can tell
You
them.
guys can tell us. All right, Alexis, you're going to have the pop quiz. Alexis from Lake Stevens, Washington. Did you see our question there? Do you have an answer?
Is it the House of Representatives?
Nice job.
There you
right.
go. There you go.
Nice job.
Keep studying, though. There'll be more than this question.
All right, go ahead, Alexis, with your question for our guests.
All right, just want to give a shout out to Mr. Heyman's AP Gov classes. And my question is, which Supreme Court cases are the most important and which should we focus on especially?
Everybody wants lists, you know, the numbers, the amendments, the court cases. Clearly, you need to know some court cases, but have a couple of favorites in your pocket to use as examples on the FRQs. But of course, the standards are Brown v. Board versus Education about civil rights, Roe v. Wade about privacy rights. That's another civil liberties case. Of course, one of my favorites is Gitlow versus New York. Gitlow versus New York in 1925 becomes that seminal moment of selective incorporation when the Supreme Court of the United States, using the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, decided to apply free speech to the states.
But the granddaddy of them all is Marbury versus Madison. And you should know that in that case, the Supreme Court gave itself the power of judicial review to review the laws of Congress, to review the actions of president, to review the laws of states and local governments to determine if they were constitutional. Marbury versus Madison.
Well, if you're talking granddaddies, McCulloch v. Maryland seemingly always finds its way on this test.
Of course, Larson had to top
National supremacy.
Of course.
All right, from Kent, Washington, Johnny is on the line. Good morning, Johnny. It's very early where you are. All right, we're going to move on then to Paige from Dublin, Ohio. Paige, good morning to you.
Hi, I just wanted to give a shout out to Mr. Reed's AP government class. My question is, what is congressional reapportionment and how does it benefit the state?
Oh, we love reapportionment, or not so much on gerrymandering. So reapportionment happens every 10 years. We know that the delegations in the House of Representatives are fixed at 435. So every 10 years we have a census, and based on population growth or population decline, different states get different representatives. You're guaranteed a minimum of one representative, and California has the most. And so every 10 years we reapportion, but then also every 10 years states will redistrict. If they have multiple districts in that state, they'll redraw the boundaries of those districts, And if a state, like the state we're from, Illinois, uses a political motivation to help protect a political party or to help protect incumbents, we call that type of redistricting gerrymandering.
All right, our next caller is Bethany from Loxahatchee, Florida. Bethany, good morning. You're on the air.
Hi, I just want to give out a shout out to my AP government teacher, Ms. Carbone, because she makes this subject so much fun. My question is, how do you differentiate between the different committees in Congress and Senate, and what are some ways to do that?
This is a great question because we know that committees is really where the work of Congress gets done. Too often we think it's about the legislative process, the floor debates, those types of things. Committees is where the work gets done. But know the difference between the different types. The most important, of course, would be the difference between standing committees and conference committees. Standing committees are those permanent committees in the House and the Senate. They're permanent. They are all about developing expertise. Members of Congress might serve on that standing committee for a decade or more. A conference committee, on the other hand, is temporary. It's created to reconcile the differences between a House version of a bill and a Senate version of the bill. Extremely important to know that distinction.
And the House does have some unique committees. One is the Rules Committee, which determines the rules for debate for legislation before it goes to the House floor. And one of the first and most important committees in the House is the Ways and Means Committee. Because the House was given the power to initiate tax laws, the Ways and Means Committee, which looks at tax laws, is enormously important.
All right. Shelby is our next caller from Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. And Shelby, you have a pop quiz here. Here's the question for you before you can ask your own. The question is, which exemplifies divided government? The choices are A, the president is Republican and the GOP holds Congress. B, the president is Republican and Democrats hold Congress. C, bipartisan efforts to fix the economy. D, partisan gridlock suspends all government activity. Or E, a three-branch government.
Is it B?
B it
Good
is.
job.
All
Divided government is when one branch of government is held by one party and another branch is held by the other.
All right, go ahead with your question, Shelby.
How does Congress check the judiciary?
Great. We love the checks and balances questions, and certainly we know that the president can appoint vacancies onto the Supreme Court, but it's really up to the Senate to confirm those vacancies. We know Congress was given the power to create the federal court system, so it's not just the Supreme Court, it's all of the lower federal courts beneath there. And of course, Congress funds the courts.
We always talk about Congress's power of the purse and Congress's power of oversight, both of which are tremendous checks on both branches, judicial and executive.
All right. And why don't you guys go ahead and remind us what our callers need to do in order to win this pocket constitution?
Well, I think we
that is
just had
inside by
it. If Shelby's still on, we still have, that was our first Congress question.
Our first Congress question. Shelby,
Yeah.
if you're still there, please call back in and give your information to our producers. Otherwise, we'll have to move on to somebody else. I apologize, Shelby. So go ahead with our next caller. Braden from Parker, Colorado is up next. Go ahead, Braden.
Hey, guys. So first, I would just like to give a shout-out to Miss Gable and my Ponderosa High School class. My question is, what type of Supreme Court cases will we have to know for the test?
Well, we've heard a little bit already about Supreme Courts, and just like my students back home, the Supreme Court, for some reason, gives them anguish. We've talked about a number of those cases, Brown v. Board, Roe v. Wade. I wouldn't be surprised this year to see maybe a little Citizens United. Campaign finance would be a really interesting FRQ this year. Certainly there'll be some multiple choice on campaign finance. I like that McCutcheon's case a couple of years ago where the Supreme Court said the aggregate limits were unconstitutional. Citizens United allowing corporate money in on the independent expenditures. But of course, the granddaddy of them all in campaign finance is Buckley v. Vallejo. Buckley v. Vallejo said that the Constitution, the First Amendment, protects money in the First Amendment, free speech.
My favorite Supreme Court case to teach is Heart of Atlanta Motel versus U.S. because it's a case where you actually learn about the Commerce Clause. You learn about Congress trying to desegregate public facilities, the end of Jim Crow laws, through the Commerce Clause, and that's Heart of Atlanta Motel versus U.S.
All right, and here is a question from Twitter about the test itself. Gentlemen, is this test given to schools outside of wealthy districts like Lincolnshire? If not, why?
This is a test that's a global test. And frankly, there's no prerequisite as far as what school you're in or where you're from. We get contacted and emails from students in Bangladesh. We get students in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, South America. These are schools all around the world. Schools in every neighborhood, in every hamlet of America are taking this test. Over 300,000 students will be taking this test, and we wish you all the best of luck.
Now, there's been a lot of debate about high-stakes testing and its role in education. Mm-hmm. Do you guys worry at all about dangers of sort of teaching to the test? How do you counter that in the classroom?
Well, it depends on how the test is formatted. So this test is written with high school teachers and college professors who look at political science 101 classes from throughout colleges across the country. And so they try to replicate what does a college course. And again, these are students who are taking not just AP Government, but I think 37 different AP tests now. And one of the goals is for a rigorous college-level curriculum in the high schools. And it's not just affluent high schools, but increasingly across the country. You see an enormous spread of AP classes and different college-level type classes, dual enrollment, IB. And so increasingly you're seeing high school students, not just the elite students, choose a more rigorous option in high school.
We call it a test with benefits, that if you do well on this test, you'll get college credit. But the good news is the studies are pretty clear. Even if you don't do as well as you would have liked, students that take an AP test in the last week or this next week will do better in college. Frankly, that's something we all want.
And I think that we're going to have to pick a new winner for the Pocket Constitution. I apologize to you, Shelby, but the next student who calls in with a question about Congress will be able to win this Pocket Constitution signed by Paul Ryan. Let's move on to Jaden from Gurnee, Illinois. Jaden, good morning. Go ahead, Jaden, you're on the air.
Oh, okay. Well, first I want to give a shout out to Mr. Secchi at Warren Township High School. And my question is the concept of fiscal federalism.
Fiscal federalism, these are those econ questions that make government teachers quake a little bit, but certainly know the difference between fiscal and monetary policy. But if you're asking about federalism, of course, we're talking about different styles of federalism. We teach marble cake federalism in our class because we think more times than not, the federal government, the national government, the state governments, and the local governments play together. They interplay, they overlap, they mix the responsibilities. Of course, there's always money involved. And so the national government uses financial incentives to encourage state and local governments to comply with certain policies. Remember, the 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states. And so there are certain things that the state governments have sovereignty over that the national government does not. But through some techniques, some might call it fiscal federalism, I suppose, there are incentives where the national government says, well, we would like you to do this. Here's money through a categorical grant, or here's money through a block grant. This is marble cake federalism. It's not layer cake.
And Mr. Larson just hit those two key grants you should know with fiscal federalism, that categorical grants are grants from the federal government given to state and local governments for a very specific purpose, and that contrasts with block grants, which is grant money given from the federal government to state and local governments for a much broader purpose.
All right, our next caller is Lane from Spokane, Washington. Lane, you have a pop quiz for your call here. Here is your question. All revenue bills in Congress, A, must pass without the consent of the president. B, must be introduced by the majority party. C, must be introduced in the president's budget. D, must originate in the Senate Finance Committee, or E, must be introduced in the House. What do you say?
Is that E?
It is, must be introduced in the House. Remember, our Constitution was right about that time, no taxation without representation. And because the House of Representatives was the only directly elected body, they are the only ones who can raise revenue.
I think Lane deserves a pocket constitution signed by Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan.
I think you do too, Lane. Stay on the line after you ask your question, and we'll get your information for our producers. Go ahead with your question, Lane.
Okay, first I'd like to give a shout out to my APGOV teacher and future president, Mr. Beal. My question is, what has weakened the influence of political parties over the political process?
Clearly, political parties have grown weaker. If you've been watching the news in the last 12 months, we've seen that. It's not all bad, but we can explain it. It's explained maybe through incumbency advantages, but for me, it's explained through candidate-centered campaigns. Candidate-centered campaigns mean that candidates can raise money and run campaigns without that party endorsement. They're running in rogue status. This has weakened political parties. We've also weakened political parties because of campaign finance reform. With McCain-Feingold, when they eliminated soft money, it took away huge amounts of money away from the national party apparatus, and this has terribly weakened them. Some would say this is a good thing. Others would say it will cause serious problems.
And Lane, one of the key steps in weakening political parties was changing the nomination process for candidates, especially presidential candidates. The move away from national conventions and state conventions into caucuses and primaries put much more power into the hands of the people rather than party leaders, and that's weakened political parties. I know on Twitter before we had some actual AP Cram sessions with Mrs. Mall and Mrs. Conti's class. They were asking about caucuses versus primaries. So you're right on with that. That's an important topic, weakened political parties and the role of the nomination.
And Andrew Canine, here's a question from Twitter that's related. Can you explain the concept of a blanket primary?
Well, there are different types of primaries. And so in Illinois, we have more of an open primary where you don't have to register as a party member to actually vote in that primary. When you go to show up to vote, they ask, do you want a Democratic or a Republican primary? Closed primaries, like what we saw in New York, where you have to be a registered Republican to vote Republican in that Republican primary, or a registered Democrat to vote Democratic.
Blanket party is one of those words that some viewers might say, uh-oh, I have never heard of that. Relax, calm down. There's going to be questions on the multiple choice you don't know. Don't blame your teacher. Don't try to withdraw your shout out. There's going to be questions that you miss. We all do. Do your best. And if you don't know the answer, make it a good guess. Don't leave it blank. On an FRQ, keep writing. Remember, think less, ink more.
Are there penalties for getting an answer wrong on
No
the AP?
penalty for wrong information, so keep writing and keep filling in those bubbles.
Megan from Longwood, Florida is our next caller. Go ahead, Megan.
Hi, first I'd like to give a shout out to my teacher, Dr. Gieslin from Lake Brantley High School. And my question is, what is the difference between the Establishment Clause and the Due Process Clause?
Well, a lot of clauses in the Constitution, a lot of students get those confused, and rightfully so, because they're confusing. So let's talk about the two clauses that you mentioned. The Establishment Clause actually deals with the First Amendment fundamental right that we have, and that is that the United States government will not establish one religion over another. Remember, we have that strict wall of separation. So the government of the United States cannot show preference to one religious group or idea. That's the Establishment Clause. The Due Process Clause deals more with Fifth Amendment and also 14th Amendment. This deals with civil liberties and procedural rights that we have.
And really, that 14th Amendment, the difference between the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause are really key. The idea that Due Process Clause is used to incorporate those civil liberties from the Bill of Rights. For instance, Mapp versus Ohio was the first time that the Supreme Court told state and local police that you must abide by the Fourth Amendment rights. And that contrasts with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment that was used in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education to desegregate public schools.
Well, for those out there playing clause bingo in the review sessions, there are a couple other clauses we can mention now, and this might give you bingo. Don't forget about the Necessary and Proper Clause, and don't forget about the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause, more than any other clause in the Constitution, has been used to enlarge the power, to aggrandize the U.S. Constitution and government.
All right. Next caller comes from Gurnee, Illinois. Brooke is on the line. Go ahead, Brooke.
Hi, I'd like to give a shout out to Mr. DeSecchi's second period class. How does the House Rules Committee, how is an important part of the legislative process?
Well, there's two parts of the legislative process in our bicameral Congress, the House and the Senate. The House is known as the cup because it's hot with the people's passions. Legislation tends to pass more quickly through the House. Typically, the majority party rules in the House. So the Rules Committee is a key part of the House process because they determine the rules for debate in the House. One of the key rules for debate in the House is typically that there's limited debate. There's no unlimited filibuster like we see in the Senate. So the House process tends to be much more quick. We see the close rule in the House where you're not allowed to add floor amendments, which speeds up the process on the House floor. And again, that contrasts with the saucer of the Senate, which cools the process down. You can delay with different floor amendments. You can theoretically have a filibuster, which takes 60 votes to kill. So that's the key differences between the House and the Senate.
All right, Sandra from Mira Loma, California is our next caller. And Sandra, since you were up so early, you are going to be treated to a pop quiz. Here you go. Here's the question. Who argues before the court on behalf of the government? Is it A, the Attorney General, B, the President, C, the Majority Leader, D, the President pro tempore, or E, the Solicitor General?
E, Solicitor General.
We are 4 for 4.
All right, you guys are doing great. Go ahead with your question.
First of all, I want to give a shout out to my APGOV teacher and third party running candidate, Mr. Relez at Eleanor Roosevelt High School. And my question is, what is the War Powers Act and how does it relate to judicial review?
I love the War Powers Act. It seemingly appears in every test. I know there's an Alexandra back in my classroom studying that right now because she missed it on the last test. The War Powers Act was an attempt by Congress in and around the Vietnam War era to bring greater limits on the president's war-making power. We know that Congress historically has deferred to the president when it comes to foreign policy. We know that the president is commander-in-chief. But wait a minute, doesn't the Congress have the right to declare war? Yes, but they haven't declared war since World War II. We've been in a lot of wars since. So Congress in the early 70s passed this law to kind of ratchet up a little bit more the check and balance on the president's war-making power, and that's called the War Powers Act. The types of provisions you might see on this test would be that 60 to 90-day limit, that after 60 or 90 days, the president needs to come to the Congress and ask for greater approval and funding. Also, that 48-hour limit that the president has to inform the Congress within 48 hours of deploying troops. These are the types of things you might see. The War Powers Act was an attempt to check and balance the executive branch.
And we've seen, you asked about judicial review as well, we've seen the Supreme Court make rulings not just on the constitutionality of laws of Congress and states, but also on presidential actions, even presidential actions as commander-in-chief. One of the most recent cases on that was Guantanamo Bay and whether or not the detainees in Gitmo had to have full due process rights.
Here's a practical question from Twitter on taking the exam. What are some test-taking techniques for students when they don't know the answer to the question?
Great question. This is what I tell my students to do. Write down the big topics. We've already kind of listed them. Foundations, federalism, participation, public opinion, Congress, the list of 10. We call it the tenables in our room, the 10 major topics in the course. Write it in the margins of the FRQ booklet. As you go through the FRQs and you get that point where you say, I don't have anything else to say, look at those topics and say, well, if it is, let's say, a campaign finance question, what could I say about foundations in campaign finance? What could I say about federalism in campaign finance? What could I say about public opinion, interest groups, campaigns and elections? Use little cues like that just to prompt you to write a little bit more. And again, if we say it another time, it's worth it. Write more. You'd be surprised how many students use pronouns, the its, the theys, the thems. This doesn't help. If you're talking about campaign finance or gerrymandering, don't say it is when you redraw the lines for partisan reasons. No, gerrymandering is when you redraw the lines. Be very explicit, restate, use examples. The examples can be hypothetical in many cases. We're not even looking, this is not a history exam where you've got to draw up names and actual dates. Examples, examples, examples.
Do you have any additional?
I would write like Mr. Larson talks a lot. But if you blank on something, like I blanked on blanket primaries, go back to what you do know. Use those context clues. You've studied hard. You've worked hard in these exams. Your teachers have really prepped you well. So use those context clues, take a deep breath, and problem solve.
All right. Mary Jane from Whittier, California is our next caller. Go ahead, Mary Jane.
Hi, I just want to shout out to my AP government teacher, Mr. Garcia from Abraham Lincoln High School. Thank you for giving it your all this year and helping us out. And my question is, how has the Supreme Court interpreted the 14th Amendment to apply to the Bill of Rights and to the states?
So this is what we call selective incorporation, and this is where, for the majority of the beginning of our country, the Bill of Rights only applied to the national government. But then that started to change with the case of Gitlow versus New York, where for the first time the Supreme Court said the First Amendment right to free speech should apply to state governments. And we've seen that incorporated, whether it be the Fourth Amendment protection from unreasonable search and seizures, the Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, to most recently the Second Amendment being incorporated back in 2010. So this has been a long-term process, a case-by-case process, and your teachers absolutely taught you right. It is the due process clause of the 14th Amendment that's been interpreted to incorporate the Bill of Rights.
All right, our next caller is Tyler from Woodruff, South Carolina. Tyler, good morning to you, and you are the lucky viewer who gets a pop quiz. Here's your question. This one's on presidential succession. After the vice president, who is next in line? A, the Senate Whip, B, the First Lady, C, Secretary of State, D, Senate Majority Leader, or E, Speaker of the House?
Is that Secretary of State?
Well, if your name's Alexander Haig, it's Secretary of State, but it's actually the Speaker of the House is next in line.
Okay.
All right, Tyler, so go ahead with your question.
Can you talk about iron triangles?
Oh, we love talking about iron triangles.
No mushroom talk this year.
No mushrooms. Let's talk corn with iron triangles. So iron triangles is an example of elite policymaking. It involves very few people. It's usually very fast without a lot of conflict. And these are not things that you typically read about in the newspaper because typically we don't care about these. Really good example is Code 21 of the Safe Food and Drug Act. Actually, it's Part 155, which does deal with canned vegetables and specifically related to corn and canned corn. Did you know that for every 14 ounces of canned corn, the FDA says that you're not allowed to have more than 7 pieces of that corn be brown or black? So that is in the federal code. The FDA regulates that. Where do they come up with that number, 7 pieces? They come up with it in the iron triangle. And the iron triangle is made up of typically a bureaucrat, probably with the FDA in this case, and typically with a subcommittee member of the House, maybe agriculture, horticulture subcommittee. And then, of course, those special interest groups. Those special interest groups may be a lobbyist who has a special knowledge about corn because she works for the National Corn Growers Board. And so that's the iron triangle. That's how you get some of the very detailed policy making that not many people care about.
Who knew we used to call the bureaucracy bean counters? Now they're corn counters. But remember, that reminds me of another synonym. Sometimes when we talk about iron triangles, you might also see issue networks. And although in political science there is a difference, on this test, iron triangle, issue network, one and the same.
Here's a related question from Twitter. What do different types of regulatory commissions do?
Yeah, well, the bureaucracy is tough. These are the questions that give our students the most difficulty because the bureaucracy is so big. We've got that White House office, that executive office of the president, where his most loyal partisan friends are giving the president advice. Extremely powerful, rule of propinquity. Then you've got the cabinet, those executive departments, Secretary of Agriculture, Attorney General, Secretary of Defense. Extremely important, but divided loyalty because they've got their departments to worry about. Then you've got those independent agencies, like the EPA, that makes environmental choices, environmental regulations. Not supposed to be partisan, supposed to be a little bit more independent from the president. Then you've got the government corporations like NASA and the post office. I mean, this is the executive branch at large. But remember, it's grown large because we have so many needs. Laws are passed. Those laws need to be enforced, and agencies are formed. A lot of times we hear talk about how big the government's gotten. It's gotten big because we got a lot of big problems and a lot of big needs. But if you can just kind of itemize and differentiate between those different layers and come up with an example for each. So don't panic. If you see that independent agency multiple choice question, and you will, just think about the EPA and think about what they do.
And like Mr. Larson's answers, the federal bureaucracy is usually expanding. And just one last word you should know is meritocracy, the idea that civil servants get those jobs typically because they're taking tests and earn those jobs.
All right, Kaya from Ellenwood, Georgia is our next caller. Go ahead, Kaya.
Hi, I'd like to give a shout out to my government teacher, Miss Henley, from our high school. And my question is, how does the media affect public policy?
Love the media.
We love the media question because we're sitting here in a studio made up of media folks. The media is extremely important. Some call it the fourth estate. Some give it the same types of power in our democracy that we would give the president, the Congress, and the courts. Because without an educated citizenry, how can we vote? How can we make educated decisions? How can we know what's going on? So we talk in our class about the different roles that the media plays, and those roles are so important. Gatekeeper, scorekeeper, and watchdog. Gatekeeper, the media kind of tells us the types of stories we should be talking about, alerting us to what really is the news. And news really isn't just entertainment. There's actually things we need to know. But the media also, as a scorekeeper, kind of tells us who's winning and who's losing. And this helps us reach that shortcut. We can't always discern all the data that we're getting. The media kind of serves as kind of a midway to tell us, who's winning and who's not. But then that watchdog function, who's going to expose the scandals? Who's going to look under that last stone and turn it over and find out something that we, the people, need to know?
And we think you should know about some of the tools and rules and amendments that are used by journalists and citizens to get access to government information. So the idea that the First Amendment, the right to free press, the right to free speech, freedom of petition, all protect media rights. The Freedom of Information Act at the federal level and at state levels, and of course open meetings, the idea that government is supposed to hold these meetings out in public.
Madeline from Spokane, Washington, you are our next caller, and you have a pop quiz ahead of you as well. Here is the question for you. What is an election where the most votes win? Is the answer A, plurality, B, caucus, C, single-member district, D, convention, or E, majoritarian democracy?
Was that B?
B was caucus. What do you guys say?
Oh, I think this is a hard question. I think anytime you have questions about numbers, it's tricky because in democracy, we do have this difference between two key numbers, and that's majority, where it takes a majority to pass a bill in the House, to pass a bill in the Senate, to confirm a Supreme Court nominee. But it also, you need a majority to win 270 electoral votes to be elected president. But the reality is, to win those state electoral votes, you need to win the most votes, which is a plurality. And a plurality doesn't necessarily mean 50% plus one, especially if you have three candidates. It could simply mean the most votes.
This is another one of those occasions where knowing the difference between just some subtleties and a multiple choice are really important. I think you'll see a plurality question, but you also might see a pluralism question. This is confusing. They're totally different. A plurality is most votes wins. Pluralism is a philosophy of government that allows competing groups to compete against each other as opposed to a few elites who make all the decisions.
Madeline, all right. Now you've learned the answer to that question. What's your question for our guests?
Well, first off, I'd like to shout out to Mr. Beal at NWC. And I would like you guys to go over the executive and judicial checks, because I know you guys went over the other one. But
So the executive checks on the judicial branch is the idea that when there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court or the lower federal courts, the president has the power to fill those vacancies. He gets to nominate. But then it's up to the Senate to give advice and consent to actually ratify the president's nomination.
The ultimate check of the judiciary, of course, is judicial review. Remember, though, judicial review isn't arbitrary. They must rule on cases that are brought to them. So the court doesn't sit back and just say, well, we don't like that and we don't like this. Citizens like you have to engage in litigation, bring suits before the judiciary, and as it rises up through the process, through district courts, the basic level, the appellate courts, and then the ultimate appellate court, the Supreme Court, then they can practice judicial review.
We've got a few more minutes left in our show. Our next caller will be Kristen from St. Charles, Missouri. Kristen, go ahead.
Hi, I would first like to give a shout out to Mr. Wayne. He's an amazing teacher. And my question is, could you explain original intent and how it has influenced court decisions?
So original intent contrasts with judicial activism. And this is kind of what do Supreme Court judges or judges use in their judicial decision making? Are they using the original language of the bill and the original intent of the writers of the Constitution of the law? That tends to be more conservative. It tends to be, we use the word judicial restraint. It's the courts restraining from changing current social policy. And that contrasts with judicial activism or loose interpretation of the Constitution, liberal interpretation of the Constitution, where we're looking at what the spirit of the law was and maybe kind of putting in our current modern day interpretation onto the Constitution or to the law.
Again, two words that oftentimes get confused relating to this topic. Jurisprudence is the technical word that describes how justices make decisions. Jurisdiction describes the issue of what cases can the Supreme Court or the appellate courts or the district courts hear. So jurisdiction deals with what authority do I have as a judiciary to hear your case. Jurisprudence, what authority do I have to decide it?
Elizabeth from Lake Stevens, Washington is our next caller. Go ahead, Elizabeth. What's your question?
Hi. First, I would, of course, like to give a shout-out to Lake Stevens High School and my APGOV teacher, Mr. Heyman. And next, my question is, how does the president impact the legislation?
Well, the president has tremendous powers. Many would argue so many more powers than were originally intended. We can debate that point, but we clearly know the president through his bully pulpit, and someday she in her bully pulpit, perhaps. The bully pulpit allows the president to navigate through the media and say, listen, I want to draw attention to this law. I want to draw attention to this process. The bully pulpit, the power of the president to negotiate and bargain with Congress is a tremendous power. The power of that president to be that gatekeeper of the news, tremendous power. But remember, he also has a large arm of supporters and advisors that he sends out into Congress, meeting with individual members of Congress, again, negotiating and bargaining. The President of the United States oftentimes is called the chief legislator. Remember, in that State of the Union address, that formal power of the president to tell the country how we're doing is oftentimes this is the president's agenda. And let's not forget the president and the executive branch create the budget. That budget provides priorities that all influence Congress.
On that budget, we have the Budget Reform Act of 1974, which does give the president tremendous power in preparing that budget. And that's where you should know parts of the White House staff, or what we call the Executive Office of the President, specifically the Office of Management and Budget, which helps the president prepare the budget, and then he presents that to Congress. They draft the budget, they write it just like a law, then it's up to the president to approve it with a signature or to veto the entire thing.
All right, and that is all the time we have for this morning's Cram session. Students, you keep on studying. Andrew Canine, Daniel Larson, teachers from Adelaide Stevenson High School, thank you guys so much for. And later on today, we will be featuring President Obama's commencement address at Howard University. We'll be covering that live on C-SPAN at 10:45 a.m. Eastern. And tomorrow on Washington Journal, we'll be bringing you Rebecca Hagelin, the former national co-chair of Women for Crews and a townhall.com columnist. She'll be talking about religious conservatives and Campaign 2016. We'll also be hearing from Jennifer Lawless. She is American University's Women in Politics Institute Director. And we'll also be joined with by Sarah Jane Glynn from the Center for American Progress. She'll be talking about how federal policies impact working mothers. That does it for us today. We'll see you tomorrow.